Welcome to Mediation Playbook, the podcast that provides winning negotiation strategies. Join us as we explore the world of holistic negotiation from experts across business and industry. Our guests will share with us their insights and draw on their experiences to provide you the techniques and tools you need to become a master negotiator. Now let's get started. All right, welcome to Mediation Playbook, everybody. I'm David Coher, your host, and with me today is Noah Healy, who is a game theorist, a market designer, and a podcaster as well. Welcome to Mediation Playbook, Noah.
Thanks for having me here, David.
Absolutely. Noah, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about kind of your background and your interest in negotiation and negotiation theory before we kind of get into it.
Sure. So I backed into this out of mathematics, and the branches of math that I got into was because I got a job programming. So in 2000, I got out of school, needed a job, and they were easy to get in programming. I actually knew a connection at this place from the Games Club at UVA. And so I started studying the mathematics of computation, which led to reading about how to manage the process of programming, which is an incredible nightmare, as it turns out. And that led to essentially the mathematics of the 20th century, where a lot of very smart people started applying the tools of logic and calculus and stuff to the problems of organization and planning and strategy, and discovered all sorts of new things that we collect under the concept of game theory. And so then I used those approaches to come up with some new communication protocols, which it turned out that negotiation and negotiation theory was essentially central to how that developed. So I'm a lot more interested in the math side of things, but these concepts, which in many cases started in the humanities, have been transformed into mathematical tools.
So can you maybe start to help us talk a little bit about what you mean when you discuss game theory? Because I think folks have an idea of what that means, but in the context of when you're dealing with a small number of variables, as opposed to what you may see in some of the more traditional, like a programming or mathematical challenge, as opposed to when you're dealing with a dozen different variables amongst two or three actors.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, that's one of the real challenges of game theory. So game theory is the analysis and description of situations with multiple decision makers. And that's something that gets very explosive very quickly. And so the idea is that number one, you have more than one agent that has some set of choices available to them. And that set could be infinite, in which case, that's a whole different ball of wax. And there are outcomes that are distinct based on the different choices. So if you and I are playing a game, and let's say we're each going to pick a card out of a deck, but my outcome is entirely dependent on the card you pick out of the deck, and your outcome is entirely dependent on the card you pick out of the deck. The fact that I'm making a choice doesn't matter here. Like, you're making the choice.
Right. So let's just can I break that down to make it a little simpler, because I just want to make sure everybody's following along. So in other words, if I pick first from a 52 card deck, right, standard 52 card deck, now I've made a choice. You now are making a choice, picking the second card from the remaining 51 cards. And then when I go to pick again, I'm now choosing from the remaining 50, and so on and so forth. The whole thing can go for quite a while, right?
Yeah. But let's imagine a very simple game where we're each going to pick a card out of the deck, and the 52 cards are all fully ranked. So, say clubs, diamonds, hearts, spades, 2 through ace. So the ace of spades is the biggest card. And whichever one of us gets the biggest card is going to win this game. Well, you're going first. You pick the ace of spades. I've got a choice. I got a free choice. I can pick any one of 51 cards, but they all lose. So do I have a choice? Not really. Like that's not really a choice.
Right. Because the game is already ended by that one card I picked. However, if I were to pick a card that, say, is number 11 on the list,
Now I have a choice. We could also make things a little bit more interesting. What if it's not a competition? What if we each have our own special table? So I've got this ordering I'm looking at, you've got this ordering you're looking at, and we're going to get paid. Basically, the higher the card on our ordering we pick, we get $1 for every higher one. Well, unless our two top cards are exactly the same card, you'll take your card and take $52, and then, 51 times out of 52, you'll have left whatever my top card was, and I'll take my top card and get $52. And even if I miss, I'll only miss by one. So my choice matters here, but not very much. But things can get more interesting if it's a cross, where I'm going to pick a card and you're going to get rewarded based on the card I pick. You're going to pick a card and I'm going to get rewarded based on the card you pick, and we don't necessarily know what the other person wants or doesn't want. Now we're getting into situations that are a lot more complicated, particularly if we're going to do this over and over and over and over again. And that gets into another branch of where negotiation really comes up, things like the prisoner's dilemma and battle of the sexes, where you have situations where what you do is completely affecting the other person. And so coming up with ways that you can live with each other or learn about each other becomes the way to win this game in the long term.
so run that through me again. So why don't you talk about a little bit about prisoner's dilemma from our listeners?
So the prisoner's dilemma is a very simple scenario. The idea is that two people have committed a crime and the police have captured them, and they're both being questioned separately. And so they can admit to the circumstances of the crime, or they can not admit to the circumstances of the crime. If both of them decline to admit to the circumstances of the crime, then they will still be lightly punished, but they will not do the full time. If they both admit to the circumstances of the crime, they will both be punished for the crime. But if one of them admits and the other one does not, then the one that chooses not to snitch will essentially do double dip. So the person who informed will go free, and the person who's informed on will kind of take on both sentences. And so this creates this scenario where each person is better off by betraying the other person, regardless of what the partner in the other cell does. If they betray you, you're better off by betraying them. If they don't betray you, you're better off by betraying them. But the best outcome for the pair of them is that they cooperate and they don't betray each other. And the only way you can get to the point where you're willing to take that risk is knowing that there's going to be a tomorrow, and that there's going to be a chance in the future, not necessarily with this person, but with people in general, to demonstrate that you're trustworthy and worth being part of something.
So it's in essence, it's additional value that is created beyond the immediate choice before you.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Once we start playing games over and over again, we get into this bizarre thing where the value of the future games can be more valuable than the value of the game that we're playing right now. And so this appears in, say, professional sports. You could say cheat to win a championship, but if it comes out that you cheated, then that championship might be away from you. You might get suspended. You might lose your future career. You might lose your Hall of Fame slots. You might lose, prestige and all sorts of other things.
So I understand that in the context of when we're talking about, so that's a great example, right? You're talking about professional sports, or I understand that in the context of when you're talking about an emotional negotiation by a limited set of parties. But how does that factor, and how do you include that in a mathematical game, where that is to say, how do you create that value in future rounds of the game or in other games for the value that was created earlier on, right? So in other words, if I'm running the same game, if it's a mathematical game and it's a simple formula, I'm running that simple formula 3 times in a row, That's different than the prisoner's dilemma and getting caught for 3 crimes, because I understand where on the second and third crime, your partner or your then current partner knows that you didn't snitch on them or whomever your prior partner was, right, in rerunning the prisoner's dilemma scenario.
Right.
May want to think about getting into a different business because you keep getting caught for crimes, but that's a separate
Exactly.
issue.
Yes. Well, so it's sort of interesting. There's two different ways that we approach this. So the first sort of trivial way. So if you have one game, you describe it as essentially a matrix. It's called the game matrix. And the way the game matrix works is it's this array of numbers where in each outcome possibility, there's a number for each participant that gives a comparison of how they feel about that outcome versus other outcomes. So that's called sort of the game matrix or the payoff matrix. And if you're going to do 2 or 3 versions of a game, then you can basically just build exponentially larger payoff matrices. So you could say, okay, I'm going to play 2 prisoners' dilemmas. So I can cooperate the first time and betray the second time, or I can betray both times, or I can cooperate both times, or I can betray first and then cooperate next. So instead of having 2 choices, I have 4 choices. And instead of there being 4 outcomes, there are 16 outcomes. And instead of having 24 possible ways that I feel about the 4 outcomes, I have 16 factorial, which is a number that has way more than billions of digits in it, or billions of values in it, about those outcomes. So I can do that. And this obviously gets very explosive very, very quickly. If I'm going to do 10 of these, then suddenly I'm talking about thousands of choices and, millions of potential outcomes, and it just gets totally insane. But it turns out that if we extend it not to a finite number of things, but to an infinite number of things, it will converge on something called the Nash equilibrium.
And say that again.
The Nash equilibrium.
The Nash equilibrium. Okay.
Yes. And so we can actually analyze properties of that simple game for circumstances that, by effectively taking the iterated values of these outcomes to their infinite conclusion. And then what will happen in the case of the prisoner's dilemma is that the value of being cooperative an infinite number of times is greater than the value of being uncooperative any finite number of times, and taking the hits from the uncooperative outcomes. And so that becomes a dominant strategy at that point, the cooperation strategy.
And is that because we can calculate it out to the outer limit of all those permutations? Or are you just saying that we can calculate out enough of those permutations that we eventually get to a place where we start to notice the pattern as to approximating that point of the Nash equilibrium?
Kind of both. So there's a thing in mathematics of limits or approaching that we get out of calculus, where you can have a process that over time is getting closer and closer to something, but never quite reaches it. And in many cases, we can replace that process with the thing that it approaches, and that becomes a very convenient equivalence. And it's not always obvious what that approach is going to be. Sometimes the approach is very slow. Sometimes the approach is relatively quick. For the game situations where the approach is relatively quick, we can use it in our real world experience, even if we're not going to, be immortal and do the same thing an infinite number of times.
Right. Okay. Right. Because obviously we can't work through all the permutations ourselves. This is all the theory, and then bringing that to practical reality. Are you suggesting then that we could, if we could quantify each of the elements of a negotiation, we could then run it through the computer, so to speak, assuming that we had sufficient computing power, determine all of the permutations, and then reach that Nash equilibrium, or determine that Nash equilibrium for that quantified negotiation?
Not only can we do that, It's also possible, and this is essentially what marketplaces do and what the process of designing marketplaces does, is that we can set up the conditions of a negotiation such that we can determine what the properties of that Nash equilibrium are going to be up front, if you will, so that the people can come in and participate in a system where when they sort of go with the grain, they're gaining the benefits of the other participants all also cooperating and causing the outcome that they want to have happen.
So, in other words, you're building because when you're dealing with market design, everybody's coming into the proverbial room of the marketplace, understanding that there has to be rules around the marketplace.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So they're accepting that there are limitations on what actions they can and can't take within that marketplace.
Yes. Chief among them, markets usually require a voluntary action. So, I might really want to sell, say my chair for $1 trillion. And if I had a trillionaire in front of me and a gun to his head, I might be able to get away with that. But in a general marketplace of selling chairs, number one, there aren't going to be any trillionaires in the room. And number two, if you start waving guns around, people are going to get, going to leave pretty quickly. So finding a way that these deals can be made, not just right now, but ongoing and for everyone is the key thing to work out.
Okay. So then what you can do in essence is you can start setting up the conditions for your negotiation in such a way that you will be able to guide where the benefits are going to be derived from, and by doing that you can then guide to the endpoint of the negotiation.
Exactly.
That's the mathematical theory.
Yep.
Converting that into practice obviously is the difficult part here.
Yes. Yes. It took me 3 months to solve the math of the commodity marketplace and another 3 or so months to figure out enough of the intricacies of the math to work out how to write the code that would actually do one of these things.
Tell me what you mean by that, by the 3 months to solve the commodity marketplace. What does that mean in practical terms? What did you do?
So, in practical terms, you need to identify what these roles are going to be in terms of what their interests and capabilities are. And then you have to work out the properties of the strategies that you're going to make available to them. So, in the case of the prisoner's dilemma, the two prisoners are offered a choice between betraying their fellow inmate or trying to stay quiet. They're not offered the opportunity to, say, attempt to escape or successfully escape. But if that's an option, that might be their best option. In sort of a real world scenario, we have many, many potential choices. And so it's important to structure things in such a fashion that the you're offering your players a range that's sufficient to all of their needs, and then you need to understand that sufficiency. And in my case, because the market, while it's constrained in one sense, I limit people to talking about pricing and amounts. I do not limit people in terms of what sorts of pricing and amounts they're allowed to talk about. And so they have effectively an infinite range of options. You could attempt to claim that the market is going to wind up being any price that you care to type into a machine.
Okay. So what does that look like then in terms of what you've built out here for applying that to commodity markets? I mean, is this a tool I can plug in and say, okay, I know what the price of gold is going to be in 3 months, right?
This is a essentially a tool that you can plug in to create a forum that will tell you what the price of gold is likely to wind up being in 3 months. So what this turns out in practice to be is two connected but separate marketplaces. One in deals where people are negotiating what the price level is going to be at periods that are logistically sensible for the commodity being exchanged. So, say electricity would be traded every 5 or 15 minutes, gold might be traded once a week. and then a second market for people making and taking delivery using those deals. And so, to put it sort of very simply, people come together and negotiate where they think future prices are going. The market integrates those ideas together to tell everybody what everybody has agreed that future prices are going to do. And then people come together a second time and decide how much they want to trade at those prices, paying a commission on each trade to the people that contributed based on how much they contributed to those pricings.
No, so you're saying based on how much they contribute to the trade, but is that contribution based on the prior information of that first go round, or is that contribution based on actual market activity?
So the commission payment is based on the amount of information provided, and that is the amount of information provided that wound up being usefully valuable. So if you just sort of blather a bunch of noise into the system, and the system, upon integrating everyone else's beliefs, decides to mostly ignore you, then you're going to get very little return for having basically wasted everybody's time. But if you more or less tell everybody exactly what's going to happen for the next 6 months, then you're going to be one of the leading, proponents of what's going on, and you're going to be rewarded very heavily for helping everybody out like that.
But in this first round, is there a requirement that I commit in some way, like I commit capital or otherwise, to what I predict for the next 6 months?
Predictions require a capital outlay, and that goes into a sort of paramutual-ish system. So the returns that predictors get are a combination of the capital outlays of predictors and this bonus capital brought in from the commissions that the information generates.
Okay. So I get extra reward for making accurate predictions by putting the money down.
Yes, yes. You get your money back. You get money from the people that put in bad predictions that you're fixing up. And then you get a bonus from the people that actually need to trade for thanking you for sort of making the prices available to them.
So in other words, it's about that volume of the as a participant getting as a successful participant, I'm going to be paying a bit of a price to the leader who drove those market prices to that higher point.
Well, not necessarily the higher point, but the point where more trade could occur, that there might be more economic.
Oh, because the volume of activity then could occur. Okay.
Right. So it's not about the highest possible price. It's about the price at which the most economic value of trade occurs, because that's what the marketplace needs.
Right. Okay. So now bringing this back from the theoretical to the practical, what that means is, in essence, it's a way of thinking about the value of the negotiator who brings forward the proposition that gets us, that moves the ball forward, right? And when you're dealing with a group negotiation, it's having some kind of a system that can reward that individual who does the best job of moving the ball forward, allows for that transactional activity.
Exactly. Yes. And that's obviously extraordinarily valuable. So by setting it up as this paramutual with a buy-in system, just as a sort of standard rake style paramutual that you might see at the horse track, can have any level of take effectively that the owners want. They could keep half or more of the betting stakes and still offer positive returns to the winners. It's just they would be smaller positive returns. In this case, we can offer extremely high rates of return to those negotiators that are moving that ball forward, as you describe it.
That's fascinating. The possibilities are very interesting. Now, obviously we've got a little bit of work to do to bring that to something to market, right?
On multiple fronts, yes.
But it's interesting. All right. Well, Noah, I appreciate your time here. Let me ask you before we wrap up. I've got two things I wanted to discuss. But first, where can folks learn more about you? You've got a podcast of your own. You want to tell us a little bit about that? Anything else you're working on?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So the podcast is called The Fourth Age, The AI Revolution. It's on all the platforms plus YouTube. And there's a Substack of The Fourth Age, substack.com or whatever that it works out to be. We've just dropped our 14th episode. And my co-host, Marty Wiener, is the former CTO of Reddit. And we talk about AI and its impacts and potential impacts on society in general, and what we need to start thinking about in order to do something about this that's productive.
Yeah. Interesting. And then you're working on other things as well, though, obviously.
Well, we talked about the difficulties in bringing this to fruition. One of the difficulties, I'm trying to get a patent through on this marketplace design. I call them coordinated discovery markets, or CDM for short. And the patent office has been breaking its own rules, lying to Congress, and otherwise behaving in a wholly insane fashion in order to not grant this patent. And so about a month ago, I started a petition on change.org that's under all caps CDM underscore patent, all lowercase patent. And I very much appreciate anybody that wanted to drop a signature on there.
Okay, great. Well, we'll include the links both to your podcast and the petition in the show notes here. And before I let you go, anything else that I haven't asked about here that this conversation brought up for you?
So, yeah, there's one of the other things about these kinds of indefinite circumstances that also comes out of game theory a little bit is kind of the learning period. And that brings up an interesting concept where, because we're mortal, too many choices can actually kill us. So if you don't sort of know anything about the environment,
Let me make sure I understand. What you're saying is, because we're mortal, too many choices can kill us, in the sense of we run out of time to test out all of our options.
right. Yes. Yeah. So if you don't know anything about the environment, you have to learn a little bit about the environment before you make a commitment. And in general, the sort of number of trials you should make is about equal to the square root of the number of things in your environment you should check against. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and there's some variation, but that's sort of a decent rule of thumb. So if you've got about 100 choices, you want to whip through like the first 10 as fast as possible. And then you just want to go explore. And the first thing you find that's better than anything you've already seen, that's the one. That's the one you stick with. And so if you have a relatively small number of choices, if you've got, 1 or 4 or 9 choices, that's 1, 2, or 3 sort of discarded choices that you're going to get. But if you have 8 billion choices, like the current population of the earth, or if AI starts tuning up and we have a lot more things and you have trillions of choices, then you want to whip through your first million choices very quickly. And people don't whip through a million things in a lifetime in most cases. So under those circumstances, it becomes much more important for social institutions that can tame this choice for us, because otherwise people are just sort of stuck spinning their wheels trying to learn enough to commit to something to get somewhere, or they don't do that, they impulsively jump into something and just sort of take that wherever it goes, and that winds up with a world where all success is essentially due to random luck, which is fine as far as it goes, but people aren't usually willing to regard their own success as random luck.
Right. No, it's obviously their own hard work or brilliance, and properly calibrating for that can be difficult.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Noah, thanks for your time. I appreciate you coming on and chatting. And like I said, if folks want to learn more, check out the show notes. Otherwise, this has been Mediation Playbook. Thank you for listening, and take care. Thanks for tuning in. If you found our show valuable, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for exclusive video content. We love hearing our listeners' thoughts and suggestions on guests or topics for future episodes, so please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or comment on Spotify, and we will catch you on the next one.